Hey everybody. Today I'm reading a piece titled Modern Capitalist Society, Competing Nation-States, Antisemitism, and Hatred of the Jewish State by Robin Stoller, co-director of the International Institute for Education and Research on Antisemitism in Berlin. Section 1, Introduction. The fear of losing national identity and the power of nation-states has once again become popular in Europe in the context of the discourse against so-called globalization, the quote unification end quote process in the European Union, and, most recently, the financial crisis. In the context of the European Union, some observers have argued that the concept of the nation-state based on ethnic or religious definitions has transformed into a transnational identity. The idea of a post-national era with a common identity and collective memory. And that's disgusting. Excuse me. It's a messy sneeze, if anyone's curious. The idea of a post-national era with a common identity and collective memory was promoted during the reforms. Footnote. See, for example, the debate among European intellectuals started by Jürgen Habermas and Jacques Derrida. Habermas and Derrida argued a common post-national European identity and foreign policy against the U.S. during the Iraq War. End footnote. Furthermore, scholars such as Bunzel, I don't know who the hell Bunzel is, I don't know. Just his last name, so it doesn't really help me. Have argued that in the age of the formation of a European identity, anti-Semitism would decline and Muslims would serve as the new scapegoats in the construction of a common European identity. Footnote. See, for example, Bunzel zwischen Antisemitismus und Islamophobie Überlegungen zum neuen Europa in J. Bunzel and A. Snef's edited volume Zwischen Antisemitismus und Islamophobie, Vorurteile und Projektionen in Europa and Nahost. Alright, so I'm not going to be reading every single thing that's in German, so I was just doing that because it caught me off guard, but I'm not going to do that in the future. I'll spare anyone who's listening hearing that. Unless there's German in the actual body of the text. I will read that, but not in the footnotes. So anyway, end footnote. But in fact, the opposite is true. Rather than disappearing, the nation-state as a regulator and the concept of the nation as an identity have remained, and the Jews are once again serving as scapegoats. Anti-Semitic statements and attacks have become more frequent and aggressive since the Al-Aqsa Intifada of 2000, the anti-American attacks on 9/11, and well over 100 terrorist suicide bombings targeting and killing as many Jews as possible, mostly in Israel. In Europe, the mass killing of Jews in Israel and anti-Semitic attacks in Europe were partly rejected as anti-Semitic, but often, at least partly, rationalized as a form of resistance against the, quote, Israeli occupation, end quote. Hating the Jews has once again become popular in Europe and is partly authorized in the mainstream media, especially in the guise of Israel bashing. Different studies show that classic modern anti-Semitic perceptions of national and international socioeconomic processes have once again become prevalent. Over 40% of Europeans agree that Jews have too much power in the business world and in international financial markets. Footnote. The poll by the Anti-Defamation League was conducted between the 1st of December 2008 and January 13, 2009 in Austria, France, Hungary, Poland, Germany, Spain, and the United Kingdom. See Anti-Defamation League's Attitudes Towards Jews in 7 European Countries, February 2009. End footnote. Over 30% blame Jews in the financial industry, at least partly, for the economic crisis. Same study. Almost half of the interviewees agree that Jews are more loyal to Israel than to the country where they live. In a country like Spain, 58% of Spaniards agree with statements such as, quote, Jews are very powerful because they control the economy and the media, end quote. The European unconscious knows about the Jews. They are, quote, not true citizens. They, quote, stick together. They have built an, quote, artificial state, end quote, on other people's land, and they dishonestly exploit and dominate nations as an alien power through the financial markets and the media. What kind of perception of the world do these people have, and how is it related to the functioning of current society? To understand some of these dynamics, this paper analyzes some of the connections between the system of competing nation-states, capitalist society, modern anti-Semitism, and hatred of the Jewish state. In order to do so, I will focus on two elements of thought in our societies and their connections to anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. First, I will focus on the role of the system of competing nation-states, with their hegemonic ideological rationales, the Republican and the primordial or ethnic national model. Both hegemonic ideological concepts have a specific impact on the perception of the, quote, Jews and Israel. Inclusion and exclusion, citizenship, rights of the individual guaranteed by the state, and the right of a, quote, nation, end quote, to its, quote, own, end quote, state depend on the ideological rationalization of these rationales. Second, I will touch upon the relation between the largely impersonal processes and functioning of modern capitalist societies and modern anti-Semitism. How do individuals perceive structures, processes, and exploitation in our society? What kind of connections exist between these perceptions and anti-Semitism? Finally, I will argue that a specific connection between both these elements, the nation-state concept and the perception of the functioning of society, forms the basis for conspiracy theories, which are projected onto Jews. One central problem in attempts to combat anti-Semitism is not only that there are Jewish stereotypes, but also that the above-mentioned elements, which form the basis of conspiracy theories and eliminatory anti-Semitism, cannot be easily deconstructed in the society we are living in. Section 2. Anti-Semitism and the Perception of the World. In his essay, Portrait de l'Antisémite, I don't know, I'm supposing it's Portrait of an Anti-Semite or Portrait of the Anti-Semite, by Jean-Paul Sartre, commented that anti-Semitism is not just a matter of taste, a question of whether or not you like, quote, the Jews, end quote. That's from actually it's apparently that piece is in English is titled Anti-Semite and Jew. Rather, Jean-Paul Sartre emphasized that anti-Semitism is a worldview that is not limited to being against the Jews. Sartre noticed that one cannot be an anti-Semite without further intellectual principles, and described elements of this specific way of interpreting social processes and structures in modern capitalist societies. In particular, he mentioned specific perceptions not only of the nation, but also of ownership structures, exploitation, money, and so forth. Adorno and Horkheimer, and later Pastone, see Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno's Elements of Anti-Semitism, Limits of Enlightenment, in Dialectic of Enlightenment, Philosophical Fragments, and Pastone's Anti-Semitism and National Socialism, and Anson Robbenbach and Jack Zipes, edited volume Germans and Jews Since the Holocaust, The Changing Situation in West Germany, published in 1986. Anyway, back to the text. End footnote. Adorno and Horkheimer, and later Pastone in particular, have examined the relationship between a specific fetishized perception of modern capitalist society and anti-Semitism. They state that, based on a fetishization of capitalist structures, anti-Semites relate a negatively perceived, quote, artificial, quote, abstract sphere, banks, stock markets, individuals, intellect, money, etc., to the Jews, as opposed to a, quote, concrete sphere, concrete work, production, factories, etc., which is perceived as good and organic, and related to the nation, people / folk. That is to say, as being not Jewish. In these anti-Semitic projections, Jews are non-workers, exploiters, intellectuals, bankers, and stockbrokers, in contrast to the national community, which consists of, quote, real workers, end quote, and honest productive industries. In the Nazi ideology, this culminated in the odious sign over the gates of the forced labor concentration and extermination camp Auschwitz, Arbeit macht frei, literally, work will make you free, or, quote, work liberates. Section 3. Competing nation-states and anti-Semitism. I want to highlight that the concept of the nation plays a significant role in modern anti-Semitism. Even if traditional and religious elements take part in a transformed form, modern anti-Semitism is related to modernity and the current form of social organization, namely modern capitalist society. We live in a society in which the political regulation of the economy and the construction of identity are built up inter alia by competing states, namely nation-states. See Bob Jessup, State Power, A Strategic Relational Approach, and Benedict Anderson, Imagined Communities, Reflections on the Origin and Spread of Nationalism. End footnote. Even if there are transnational dimensions of political regulation of economic processes, the main players are still nation-states competing with each other. Furthermore, the nation-state is the only institution to be addressed by political actors and movements, especially in times of crisis. What kind of relation exists between the state and the population? There are two predominant rationales for the inclusion of individuals in and the exclusion of individuals from nation-states. They are those ideological rationales that legitimate the rights of citizens, the existence of the state, and the extension of state territory. First, there is the Republican concept based on the rationale that all the individuals living in a territory are members of the nation and therefore receive citizens' rights. Secondly, there is the primordial concept based on genealogies either, quote, folkish, end quote, ethnic, cultural, or religious. Footnote. These two models are the hegemonic forms in Western societies, but there are also other models. Unfortunately, I cannot focus here on other societies such as Arab societies, the complex situation of colonial and post-colonial nation building, or the competing ideologies of nationalism, pan-Arabism, and Islamism. It is important to note that under the hegemonic interpretation, you can only be part of one nation, one person, one nation. And in the face of competing nation-states, you have to serve the interest of, quote, your own, end quote, nation only. Both concepts, the Republican and the primordial concepts, have a specific impact on the perception of Jews in Israel. Footnote. This point comes up in times of crisis and war, but is also related to the tax system, elections, the issue of social welfare, and so forth. End quote, or end footnote. Section 4. Jews, citizenship, and the loyalty to the nation. Consider the Republican perspective towards the Jews in the 19th century. Those who supported the political emancipation of Jews, regardless of their religion and culture, often did not like the fact that religious Jews still believed in the Jewish religion. Religious Jews were perceived as, quote, obstinate, end quote. Secularized Jews who held on to Jewish heritage and rejected assimilation into secularized Christian culture were perceived as, quote, others, end quote. The price or expectation for the right of political emancipation was assimilation into Christian secularized culture. without naming it as such. If Jews assimilated but still claimed to be Jewish, this contradicted the loyalty of the nation concept, one nation for each citizen. In the case of the primordial nation concept, three rationales can be distinguished: religion, culture, and, quote, folk. If the rationale of the nation was based on religion, it was Christian. If the concept was based on culture, it often, implicitly, signified a secularized Christianity, which did not include any explicit Jewish heritage. If the concept was based on, quote, folk, end quote, a German concept, it included a genealogy of blood, and the Jews could therefore not be part of the nation. Within the framework of these concepts, assimilated Jews in particular were suspected of destroying the nation from within. A different situation arises when we touch upon the perception of the Jewish state of Israel. Section 5. The Jewish state of Israel, nation and territory. When one looks at Israel and Israel's perception through the lens of the primordial and republican rationales of the nation, one can observe some interesting changes. First of all, there's the traditional anti-Jewish concept, the primordial or ethnic one. This concept can be found among self-identified right-wingers as well as some left-wingers. From this perspective, a nation is established through genealogy, ethnic, cultural, religious, or other. Some consider the Jews a nation, but most do not, because Jews are perceived as a, quote, mixed race, end quote, or just as a religion living as, quote, guests, end quote, among nations. Their fathers and mothers do not have the same blood. But even if the Jews are considered a nation, the nation concept connects population and territory in a specific way. Under this concept, a nation is constituted through a particular form of genealogy, of the population living, quote, forever, end quote, in a common territory, a, quote, autochthonous, a, quote, autochthonous, end quote, population. The hell does that word mean? It's got auto in it, so I'm assuming that means something like self. It says autochthon, ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, the concept of autochthones, I think maybe it's autochthones? I don't fucking know. People sprung from Earth itself means the indigenous inhabitants of a country, including mythological figures, as opposed to settlers and those of their descendants who kept themselves free from an admixture of colonizing entities. In mythology, autochtones are those mortals who have sprung from the soil, rocks, and trees. They are rooted and belong to the land eternally. Oh, it has a thing here. I'll say it aloud for you.
Autochthonous. Autochthonous.
Autochthonous. Jesus Christ, I was saying it wrong. Autochthonous. Indigenous rather than descended from migrants or colonists.
Autochthonous.
Autochthonous. Look, learn something new every day. Hopefully I'm learning something new here. Under this concept, a nation is constituted through a particular form of genealogy of the population living, quote, forever, end quote, in a common territory, and a, quote, autochthonous, end quote, population. From this perspective, Jews should not be allowed to live in Palestine as a nation, since the so-called Palestinian nation, which is perceived as Arab, has lived there forever. The, quote, autochthonous, end quote, Palestinians have the right to live in Palestine, while Israel as a, quote, artificial, end quote, construct has to disappear. This concept goes together with such expressions as, quote, Israel as a cancer, end quote, quote, colonizers, quote, imperialists, quote, occupiers of Palestine, end quote, and so forth. Under this primordial concept, there is no space for the Jews, neither as, quote, guests, end quote, among the autochthonous populations of Europe, nor in Palestine. This brings us to the liberal or leftist Republican concept and its position towards Israel. Under the Republican concept, a primordial concept is against universalistic principles. Different concepts related to Israel can be found, which at the end of the day all serve as political ammunition against Israel as a Jewish state. First, there's the concept that every nation state has to disappear, the post-national perspective. The focus is mostly on Israel since it is one of the more recent states to be established. Yeah, this post-national perspective is not universalized at all. There's one state and one group of people who must be forced to accept cosmopolitanism, but no other. Even though it would be good for all states to embrace cosmopolitanism in an ideal world. From this perspective, the deconstruction of nation states would therefore start with Israel. But the concept of the one-state solution, a common Jewish-Palestinian state, also means the destruction of the Jewish state. A two-state solution with equal rights for Palestinians and Jews in Israel would also cause problems given the demographic situation, even without considering the, quote, right of return, end quote, of the so-called refugees. But what is emphasized most in this perspective is the fact that Israel defines itself as a Jewish state. Whether it does so ethnically or religiously, either definition reminds the European, quote, progressives, end quote, of their history. Footnote. I wish to thank Robert Fine for some ideas in this regard. Check out the books, the stuff I've made a playlist recently of pieces by Robert Fine, particularly on Marxism and law are the main things I have from him. Whether it is the religious definition stemming from feudalism or the ethnic definition prevalent in modern capitalist societies, both definitions are seen as having been transcended in Europe and should therefore be overcome in general. From this, quote, progressive, end quote, perspective, a nation state with a definition of citizenship based on ethnic or religious genealogy is perceived as racist and something that should be opposed. These universalistic rationales, which historically supported the political emancipation of Jews in Europe, regardless of their ethnic, religious, or cultural genealogies, are now being used by the strongest enemies of the Jewish state. Something to think about, especially speaking of Robert Fine, is the way that left anti-Semitism historically takes the form as like there's this like community, this universalist community of human beings, right? But there's one particular group that will not cooperate, ostensibly will not cooperate with this international community of peoples who are distinctively particularistic, distinctively self-serving, distinctively looking out for their own and things of that sort. That I think that might be like kind of like the core idea of like a left anti-Semitism, right? Is that we all want justice, and we all want a just international order, but there's this one particular state that's causing disproportionate global problems, and that is the Jewish state that insist upon sticking to its own particularistic ways. That's kind of like I think this is just a side note for me. That seems to be like the core of like the core like gist of what I think you could call left anti-Semitism. Anyway, sorry, I'm just rambling. From this, quote, progressive, end quote, perspective, a nation state with a definition of citizenship based on ethnic or religious genealogy is perceived as racist and something that should be opposed. These universalistic rationales, which historically supported the political emancipation of the Jews in Europe regardless of their ethnic, religious, or cultural genealogies, are now being used by the strongest enemies of the Jewish state. Such universalistic perspectives have become rationale for opposing the existence of the Jewish state. The system of competing nation-states and their hegemonic rationales does not include a Jewish state, which can serve as a state of refuge for all persecuted Jews or as a nation-state for the Jews. Section 6. Israel Jews in the diaspora and disloyalty. What kind of situations do Jews who are not living in Israel face in the context of a system of competing nation-states? From the point of view that every citizen is part of one nation and has to serve the interest of their nation-state, every Jew is perceived as potentially disloyal towards the state where they are living. The traditional general suspicion of disloyalty of Jews becomes worse when it comes to Israel. In a society based on competing nation-states, every Jew is potentially accused of being more loyal towards Israel than to their nation-state. Furthermore, as Israel is the only nation-state in the world that threatens to be exterminated along with its population, every Jew speaks out against the threat every Jew speaking out against this threat is automatically perceived as a, quote, Zionist, end quote, force. In the perception of anti-Semites, every Jew is an Israeli ambassador and is treated as such. 7. Section 7. I want to come back to the second aspect of modern capitalist societies mentioned in the introduction, namely the impersonal functioning of such societies and the perception of processes and structures. How is the function of capitalist societies perceived, and how does this relate to anti-Semitism? In contrast to feudalism, exploitation and the production of wealth is not effective through immediate personal dominance in capitalist societies. No individual is physically owned by another. Modern capitalist societies are based on contracts between, quote, free and, quote, equal legal entities. Every individual has to sell their labor power on the market if they do not have property for everyday production. The employer does not own the employee. Modern society is based on modern private property and on contracts between, quote, independent and, quote, equal individuals. The employer contracts the employee. The employee is, quote, free, end quote, to choose the employer. The employee produces wealth for the employer, and the employee is paid for his or her daily production. If the employee does not receive enough money for his or her daily production, no one is directly responsible. The employee can, quote, choose. Especially during crises, when employees earn less, employers cannot accumulate capital and the state can no longer regulate, a responsible party is searched for. In the common perception, banks, stocks, shareholders, multinational companies, and the politicians are held responsible. People search for culprits and personalize the responsibility of the impersonal capitalist accumulation process. This is the point where the system of competing nation-states is relevant. When the political regulation of the nation-state is not able to guarantee a minimum amount of wealth for the daily production of its population, quote, foreign forces, end quote, traders, quote, stockholders, quote, banks, and, quote, corrupt politicians, end quote, are blamed. The, quote, cosmopolitan, end quote, Jews, who are, quote, everywhere, end quote, have no fatherland and are not perceived as part of the nation, are thus blamed for the misery and social processes that are perceived as being bad. This specific connection between the perception of the impersonal functioning of capitalism and the system of competing nation-states culminates in the Jews being blamed for a, quote, global conspiracy, end quote. The Jews are perceived as acting against nations either from within those nations or against the Palestinians, Arabs, or Islam. If the Jews contradict the existence of the nation-state, and if they are to blame for the above-mentioned misery, as they are according to this perception, in the logic of the anti-Semites, there is only one possible way of dealing with them. This perception of the world therefore makes anti-Semitism the most dangerous ideology in society today. Robin Stoller. Thanks for listening.